10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Game over.
Welcome to Game Over Montreal. You've heard the familiar refrain. We're covering another Montreal Canadiens loss, but you know what? We're not going to bring any negativity into this one because it was a gutsy effort. And after a pretty Harlem Globetrotters-like first period, and let's face it, overtime from the Colorado Avalanche, for 2 periods, the Canadiens put up a very strong fight against arguably the best team in the league. And I think that's something to be happy about at this stage of the season and with the way things are going. So let's get into it. I've got a great guest with me today. It's Shane Malloy. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. I thought the Montreal Canadiens, other than that barrage they got hammered with, and obviously the 2 penalties that they took in the first period, I mean, other than that sequence and that time frame, I thought they played a really strong game. And look, young goaltender came in there and he gave them a chance to win and get points. And that's, I mean, I know when you sort of look at it, you go, oh my God, it's like he gave up 3 goals, but look, they gave him a chance. I mean, look, I thought like Hoffman had a brilliant chance. I thought there was some 2 great chances in the first period that Lehkonen could have hammered in. So there was opportunity for them to win this game. Like there was opportunities. Yeah. So I think if you go back into the locker room after the game, I think the coaching staff has to look at that as positive. Like this is what you can build on. I mean, there's no illusions to the Montreal Canadiens. They're going to end up being one of the bottom 3 teams in the league by the end of this season, because even with people coming back from COVID and injuries, like to be able to trudge up that hill, that's very unlikely. So they're really in an interesting position when it comes to this upcoming draft of where they're going to fall and who potentially is there at 1, 2. I mean, we know who there is at 1, but 2 and 3 I think it's still fluid. I have my own personal thoughts. It's still early. This is it's mid-season, so everything's going to change. But I have some thoughts about their potential Montreal roster construction and who they could sort of target in that area as well.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, like I think the last 3 games, the Canadiens have given up something like 51, 53,
yes,
or maybe 52, and now 46 shots tonight. And I think you could argue relatively easily that they're 3 of the best games that they've played in a very long time. They're 1-0-2, and I know we're not exactly people, Leafs fans who always jump in the chat because this is SDPN and it's built on the back of Leafs Nation, so there's Leafs fans that come onto the show every night and they get upset whenever I talk about something positive about this crap-tastic season. But for the Canadiens fans, you've got to latch onto something, right? And no one is saying, oh, all of a sudden they're fixed and they're going to run the table and make the playoffs at the end of the day. But like you mentioned, something to build on. I think there is stuff through the last 3 games that you can see building blocks to go forward into next season. I think this is the game that a lot of people wanted to see Caden Primo have specifically to kind of show hey, this kid can actually dominate a game. Yeah, he can play. And the way that he hung with especially the top line in Colorado tonight, I think my hat's off to him. And Sam Montembeault as well has been spectacular the last couple starts there. It's good to see that kind of stuff, not just on a looking forward level, but also straight up on an entertainment level. When it's 2 or 3-0 in the first period, it gets draining to watch those games every single time. I'm speaking for myself here, but I know that a lot of people agree with me. It's just not entertaining. So giving the fans something to watch that's fun is good. And honestly, at this stage, you do want them to not go on a huge winning streak because you want to get that first overall pick or a top 5 pick. But having close losses like they've been having, I think is almost the best possible scenario where you can see things, falling into place a little bit, but not enough to actually get on a winning streak, which is, a very defeatist mentality if you're the team, if you're the coaching staff or the players. But for fans, I think
and
that's
management and
Yeah,
looking
and
down
management.
the future, and that's fine. And they'll never say it publicly, but behind the scenes, certainly they look at that from that standpoint. And it's about building blocks to like for those players that have come up from the American Hockey League and the younger players. You need that. You can't be in a situation like, look at what's happening in Edmonton and that type of mentality. You can't have that creep in, right? Because that type of mentality and emotions is contagious. And you got to stop that. Like, you got to kill that at the door. So yes, Montreal Canadiens have been losing, but if you can hang in there in the battle, it just brings something to the locker room. You don't have that defeatist attitude. You can't have that. So I think tonight's game was like something that they can hang their hat on and go, hey man, let's just every game, let's stay in the fight, because you got some guys on that bench that know what it's like to stay in the fight. So they're not going to allow these players to they're going to emphasize that moving forward.
Yeah, and I've been, I think, deservedly very harsh with like Ben Sherratt and David Savard. That pairing together has been terrible, but I thought they were really strong tonight. Spent a lot of time against the Avalanche top pair. They didn't, they didn't dominate or anything like that. They just kind of like held it relatively even compared to the rest of the team.
Which is really what they're supposed to do.
Exactly.
In that respect. And one of the things
Sherratt, he thought it was the playoffs out there. He got caught once on getting a penalty, and then he was like confused about it. It was a super obvious penalty, but he nailed McKinnon twice and he nailed Rantanen twice in that game. And to me, that's like, hey, people who want to trade for me, this is what I can do when they stop calling penalties, which is very interesting because he's kind of, I don't know, he hasn't been playing soft. I don't want to say that, but he hasn't been running after and trying to target guys lately. I think, just at a certain point in the season like this, you just can't do that physically every game.
He's got to pick his spots, and look, he
100%.
is, and he's a second pairing D. David Savard's a second pairing D. Like, they're both probably number 4s, to be honest, on a playoff team. So when you put them with different usage and deployment against a top line, that's not where they should be. Yes, you can do that over time, but they can't be the number 1 defense grouping against the McKinnon line all game long, because sooner or later there's going to be a breakdown. So, and that's the situation they have with the defense core. And this is where I think you look at the Montreal Canadiens moving forward is, depending on what happens with the draft, if they get first overall and they get Shane Wright, okay, it sort of changes the roster construction up top. But look at defense. What's the philosophy of your roster construction on defense moving forward? Everybody chases after the number 1s and number 2s. Look what Chicago did in trading for Seth Jones and the assets they paid and then the contract they paid for it. You can't really do that. Unless you have a plethora of really strong prospects and you can really sort of like almost bleed it out to do that. In other ways, you can't do that. So how do you look at your roster on defense moving forward? Petrie is older. He's going to have to be replaced at some point. What are you going to do? Like, there may be a different philosophy. I can tell you a quick story. I was sitting down having lunch at a U18s in Slovakia with Ken Holland when he's still in Detroit. And we were talking about different roster constructions prior to Vegas coming in. And I said, can you win? Can you go to the Stanley Cup final with a defense with 4 number 3s and 2 number 4s? Can you do that, right? With an elite, with a really good goaltender. And he didn't think you could because he was concerned about having that number 1 D-man and playing the 28 minutes. But my philosophy was you could roll out three defense lines and play 20 minutes each. And the best guys on power play power play, best on penalty kill play penalty kill. But you don't have these issues in terms of matchups throughout a game, even into the playoffs. So it's something perhaps the Montreal Canadiens can consider moving forward is maybe you don't have to chase for that number 1. And maybe like we look at our prospect pool, we don't really have that. Caden Gooley, I wouldn't consider that.
No.
So, right. So what do we do? Well, it's easier in acquisition, whether it's in a trade or free agency, to get 3s and 4s, right? So if you have 2 4s, go after 4 number 3s. And what's the cost on the cap? You're going to be in that $5 million range. Well, that's okay. That's fine. You can manage 4 of those guys easily. It's when you have those first and number 1 and number 2s at $8 million, a hit, 8.5 million, 9 million. Then what do you do at the bottom? All right, now I have to have a defenseman who's like a legitimate number 6 out there at $1.5 million. And then I got to protect him. And the same with maybe your number 5. And I just don't like that roster. Like, look, if you happen to get a number 1 defenseman in the draft, lucky you. But, the likelihood of acquiring it is so rare that I think this new management has to consider what they're going to do moving forward in that respect.
Well, and I think you could look at, I think it was the 2017 Penguins that won the Cup. Who was their number 1 D? Right. Were they were nowhere close to having a number 1 because Letang was out the whole playoffs.
Out, right. And you look at Carolina's D when they had won the Stanley Cup against Edmonton. So there are defense cores like that you can look at and go, okay, so we can have these 4 number 3 defensemen, and yeah, they're not elite, but they're so good in a variety of different areas. It provides you value when you're rolling those pairings out. So it's something I'm just curious. It'll be a conversation I'll probably end up having with, when I get a chance to talk to Jeff, and then, as well as with Marty Lapointe, who we have on Hockey Prospect Radio on our show on a regular basis to talk about those kind of things. Because he's been in player development, he's been player personnel, he's had a lot of hats with this organization. So I'm curious to see what they're going to do and what their strategies and what their thoughts are moving forward. Because you can always glean something from those conversations.
Yeah, even if you're not asking
direct
they're not
questions.
answering exactly what you want, but they'll let something.
They give you nuggets. They always do.
Yeah, exactly. Talking about this game a little bit more before we move on to more of the Canadiens, a wide look at what they're going to do going forward. We talked about the last 3 games being a bit more of what you want to see in this kind of year. And the intensity is ratcheted up. And I brought it up on the last show as well that I don't think it's a coincidence that this has happened as Tyler Toffoli came back into the lineup. And specifically the substitution of Toffoli onto the Suzuki line, which has allowed them to move Hoffman off that line. And I do think Hoffman has been better now that he's been away from higher competition. And he does seem like he's skating a little bit harder because he wasn't skating very hard before, and maybe that's a reaction to actually getting demoted after not getting demoted at all, despite not playing hard.
Part of it is also having to think more.
Yeah,
when you're having to play against top lines and top defense pair, there's more thinking and not instant reaction to the play, right? And that's when you can slot people where they need to be, and that's unfortunately what injuries cause chaos, and COVID caused chaos to that moving forward. So that's where you see the disruptions and the lopsided losses for Montreal, is because guys are nowhere near where they need to be
100%.
in terms of their effectiveness. So that's a huge factor. I talk about usage and deployment on our show all the time, and how critical that is to the success of a team, of slotting people in the right place. And sometimes as fans, you sort of forget the difference between how great a first pairing decor is versus a second, and how much better they are at insulating and taking away time and space. And you maybe not notice it, but you're just not getting anything. And Hoffman has no business going against a first pairing on a regular basis. Sure, he's going to get out there on occasion. That's going to happen, but you don't want him out there more than a couple shifts a game.
Yeah, and Suzuki's kind of used in a power on power role too, right? Plekanec was back when he was the number 1 center for the Canadiens. So putting Hoffman in that situation where not only is he facing top defenses because they're trying to defend the top line, he's facing top offenses and now has to think about the consequences of his plays with the puck all the time. And it's just not a situation that works. But Toffoli, meanwhile, is a very, very smart player, and him and Suzuki were absolutely on fire tonight. I thought they played a fantastic game. I haven't checked what the overall possession numbers were because I know that team wide, it's not going to be very good, but I thought that they were putting some magic together every time they were on the ice in the offensive zone, especially. And they even managed to score a power play goal on what looked like an absolutely terrible power play, but they just salvaged it at the very end there. And I just think those two together, when Toffoli said after the last game, that he wants to stay in Montreal and be part of like the solution going forward. And I know Josh Anderson said the same thing, but his contract is not really tradable. So that kind of goes without saying. No offense, Josh. But Suzuki's contract is unbelievably tradable. And I think you'd have a lineup of like 22 teams trying to get him if you put him on the market. But I'm wondering now, the more I see him and Suzuki, how well they play together, how much of an impact Toffoli has on this group. Like every team that sells away everything, the rebuild lasts forever, right? You know, we've seen it in Columbus when they were first coming in. We've seen it in Buffalo. Like
we see it in Arizona now.
Yeah. You have to have somebody to shepherd in the next generation. And I feel like the two guys that are like 100% on my list right now, and like my idea could change. Like if I'm Kent Hughes and somebody comes up and they're like, I'm going to offer you a first round pick in 2022 and 2023 for Tyler Toffoli. I'm like, okay, bye Tyler, love you, but you're gone. But it's unlikely to get that return, right? So I'm thinking Tyler Toffoli and Artturi Lehkonen are two guys that bring it every single night. They're intelligent hockey players that can bring valuable insight into the young kids that make up the core of this team as it goes forward. I don't know if I'm that interested in trading either of them.
Well, the factor is, and then you add Josh Anderson into that, what they do is insulate the younger players, right, on the ice. It's really important to have insulation there. So like when you start bringing up guys, and we'll go through the prospects later, but even if you look at Caulfield, you know, and Poehling, just as two examples, is they need that level of insulation. And Toffoli's won. Like he's won cups. He knows what it takes, right? So that type of mental preparation, emotional preparation, but also be able to handle stress. And that's what I think poise really is. There's the intellectual aspect of it, of being able to recognize the situation, but emotionally you have to compartmentalize that. And the guys who can't do one or the other always end up like not rising in a place, or at least staying at their level. So I think Toffoli's great at that. And what he does with Suzuki is he's great at finding soft ice, but having fantastic puck support. It's one of the things he learned when he was with Sutter. And you look at the Calgary Flames when they're playing well, their puck support is fantastic all over the ice. And it's like puck support, so that when Suzuki needs the dish, so he can go find space, Toffoli's always presents a stick and he's at the right body position. I'm like kind of doing that in my chair, but that's what it really, when you watch Toffoli play, that's the essence of his game in the neutral and offensive zone, is really so much of that. And that makes it so much easier to play with a guy like that. Like when I played, I didn't do that for you, but I was also a defenseman and I was slow and my best move was off the glass. So that's a whole nother conversation.
I mean, I was a goalie, so I've got none of that. You know, my instincts are not there. And after blowing out my ankles, I can't really skate that well anymore anyway. So I'm not moving very quick. But I remember I was talking to someone recently and they were saying like Kent Hughes mentioned like speed as like a big factor in what they wanted to build for the new identity of the Montreal Canadiens, like ideally in his mind. And they're saying they didn't think that Toffoli fit in there. And I was like, speed means more.
What speed is.
Yeah, speed means more than just skating, right? And Toffoli's not a swift skater, but yet if you look at his, like especially last season with the way the Canadiens played, a lot of his offense came off the rush. How do you think a guy is able to create offense off the rush when he's not like fast? It's intelligence, right? It's that it's when people talk about
speed through the puck.
Speed through the puck and speed through opponents, right? Like, do you remember there was like a thing that went viral a couple of years ago and they were talking about how like Connor McDavid is not the fastest skater in the NHL, but when they did that test where you had to like react to like different lights going off and change a lane, he was like blowing the doors off of everybody. Toffoli is not McDavid, but I think he has that same reaction, like not the same level, but he has that same strength in that his reaction to open spaces is very strong. So he finds
spatial
ways
awareness allows him to do
that. Yes.
And one of the other factors is, we'll use an analogy for football, because I played DB and slot, and you look at Kopp as a wide receiver with the LA Rams. He is not the fastest player, but he's one of the best receivers because he understands how to use his speed relative to his line mates and relative to the defenders around him. So you don't have to be blazing off. Like, I don't know if you're like some of your like listeners and you may remember Rico Fata, drafted in the first round by the Calgary Flames. Man, blazing speed. and he would skate himself right into a dead end or right into a bad spot. And it looked, actually his speed became a detriment to his game and to his line mates. So it's not always about the best speed. It was like, go back to a quote. It was funny when Bob Gainey was the GM in Dallas, and he made the trade to get Guy Carbonneau. And one of his pro scouts said to him, but he can't skate anymore. He's not fast. He goes, he knows where to stand. So he knows where to be, right? So he makes up for that because he always knows where to be and where his body position is. Toffoli does that too. You can look at Mark Stone. I don't care that Mark Stone's an average skater against his peer group in the NHL. He always knows where to be. He's and he understands how to use his speed. How to use your speed is more effective. And we have this on an ongoing section in our show with Pat Malloy, same last name, but we're not related, but he's a Malloy, so he better, hopefully he's smart. And he talks about that in terms of his player development, is understanding about what speed really is. It's not just a guy who burns it when he's chasing after a puck. That's not always what it really means in the end of the day.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of Matthew Lombardi, who everyone expected to become this number one center because he was such a ridiculously fast skater. Yes. And he had some good seasons, but he never quite lived up to the high end thought that everyone thought, because it's not just not using your speed efficiently, but also your speed doesn't really matter that much if you can't also handle the puck at that speed. That's another thing that separates McDavid.
Process, yes.
Yeah, the way that McDavid can process information and keep the puck on his stick while at top speed, and also his speed intervals, right? Where he's able to change speed. That was a big thing with probably aging myself a little bit here now. Joe Sakic. Joe Sakic's big thing was he was pretty quick, but also he would slow down, then speed up and slow down in one sequence. Yeah.
It was a king of the 3/4 speed. It drove defensemen bananas because you don't know how to gap up that, right? Right.
Or you think you're good, and then all of a sudden you're not, and the wrist shot's in the net already.
Yeah, because what he'll do is he'll angle off on you, and then you go to adjust, and then all of a sudden you've left these lanes open. Oh no! I remember watching him all through the 90s, going, uh-oh. And the only guy who effectively could handle him was Lidstrom.
Yeah,
because you could handle the gaps properly, and that's what made Joe. And that's a great point you brought up. And we talk about on our show is that notorious 3/4 speed that just drives defenders nuts.
Yeah, it 100%. It's super fun, and I find looking back at old highlights of, I like watching old highlights of Sakic and Forsberg. They were my two favorites after the Patrick Waugh trade when I started watching Colorado a lot. But yeah, it's just incredible. I find you can glean a lot of really cool insights by watching old stuff. It's because the game today is super fast. So if you're not trained necessarily at what to look for, I suggest watch some games from the 90s. That's the one advantage of the clutch and grab era.
Yes,
is things happen a little bit slower.
Yeah, because you can pick things up in terms of particularly positioning and puck support and how important that was, and angles. Whereas today, if you're not trained as a scout, and I was really fortunate because I had really great mentors to help me learn that craft. It's exceptionally hard. It's the hardest job in hockey, particularly at the amateur level. I even find myself when I watch a game is I can't turn that off. The only time I could ever turn that off is, and I was laughing with Brad on our show about it, is that if we go to a game with our buddies and we drink alcohol.
Yes.
Right. It's the only way to turn scout off, is because otherwise I'm assessing what's going on constantly. I can't, it's just, once you have it, you have it. Whether you do it well or not, it's just, that's what happens.
I like that caveat.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're pretty settled on this game. I think that everyone should be in agreement that this is a pretty fun game to watch. I thought it was a great effort from the Montreal Canadiens, especially Caden Primo. I really like Suzuki, Toffoli, Lehkonen. Again, props to Sherratt and Savard for holding the fort. But let's talk about Kent Hughes and what he could do here, because I know this is something that you were excited to chat about, Shane, was what is Kent Hughes' strategy going to be? And I asked last show, I didn't get a chance to read them all out, but I asked just a question of the day thing, what do you want Kent Hughes' first move to be as general manager? And almost everyone answered one of two things. Trade Ben Sherratt for a good return before he gets injured at the deadline, or revamp development for prospects. Like, build a development team, build a skills coaching system like Toronto has. What do you think Kent Hughes' biggest moves going forward this season are going to be?
Honestly, nothing. It has nothing to do with the roster. Nothing to do with the roster. I think his biggest and most important decisions will have to be in his hockey operations staff. So he has a lot to work to do. And it's a difficult situation because it is January, and unfortunately you can't, majority of the teams don't allow lateral moves, so you can't move an assistant GM to another assistant GM position. So there's some big open holes. There's obviously an assistant GM position that is required in Laval. There's another assistant GM position that is required to manage both the pro and amateur staff, which is critical. I know you have Marty Lapointe there, who's done a lot of different things in terms of director of player personnel and player development. So he has some versatility inside of that hockey ops, which is really important. I've had him on my show many times. He's very thoughtful, very articulate, exceptionally hard worker, takes pride in his work, which I think is really important. From that standpoint, you have to shore up your player development department. You have two people, which is crazy. So I think you need to have two people in the NHL, two in the American League, and then two that actually just go out just for prospects alone. So you're going to need 4 more people in your player development department. There's that. And somebody to head up that department in terms of looking at it from a business perspective, because it's human dynamics and it's human performance. So you have to specifically have a plan where you're not, and I think he brought it up in his press conference about not having siloed departments, where there is constant communication between the coaching staffs from the American League, your player development department, your both your assistant general managers through to your, now I know the media tends to use the term analytics staff. I think it's antiquated and it needs to stop, because it's not reflective of what it really is. What the Montreal Canadiens are a Fortune 500 company. So if you look at like with Jeff and with Kent, and if you're going to build this out properly, it's a research and development department. And what you require, and I know lots of people talk about diversity, I think what they really need is cognitive diversity, which is different. So like you can have, for instance, like our mutual friend, Rachel Dory, was hired by Vancouver. Now, although we are separated by about 20 plus years in age, and she's a woman and I'm a guy, our thought processes are actually really similar. So we don't have, in terms of, although we could work great on a staff together, our cognitive diversity is pretty similar. So what you want to be able to have in your staff is not just a bunch of analytics people. Look, like, unless you, like, some people don't understand what analytics really is in terms of what it's a singular discipline that's myopic. So yes, it is valuable, but if you look at it from an academic standpoint and research standpoint, it's only one sliver. You're gonna need somebody who understands statistics, which is another discipline that's sometimes myopic. Then you're going to want to have somebody who understands entrepreneurial, interdisciplinary business, so that you can start to actually integrate all these different disciplines. You're going to want somebody who understands player development and performance management. That's going to be a critical component. You're probably going to even need to have somebody else who understands like the coaching aspect of it as well. Have like a team of 4 or 5 people and spend money on it. Like, don't try to like hire somebody who is just out of like their undergrad, is 22 years old or 23 and doesn't have a lot of experience. Like, you have Jeff Molson has the money. Like, I would be hiring somebody with a master's degree minimum, plus you need to have experience, practical experience. I'd actually be searching for people with PhDs or people who are taking PhDs to be in that department, because you have to do research at that graduate level. And doing research, like I started doing research as an undergrad, and then the difference between the research I do now in graduate school, it's like night and day, because having to go in front of your committee and having them like pound you around like a roadside pinata is entirely different, because the level of scrutiny you have to have for that is really critical. So if I look at it from an overview, like Kent and are going to have to hire 2 assistant GMs, probably 3 or 4 people for player development. They're going to have to hire an entire R&D department on top of that, and then start thinking about what has happened with their scouting and their success rate. Because if you look in the salary cap era, and although I really like Trevor Timmons and the guys that were there in the salary cap era from 06 to like 15, that 10 years, they were the worst drafting development team in the entire league in terms of efficiencies of getting players to play 200 plus games in the NHL. Like, because the first thing you need to do, and it was actually funny because I do see it out in the Twitter sphere that people use 200 plus games in 5 games before the analysis. That was actually something that I had developed back in like 2007, 2008 when I was running for TSN and Sportsnet, and it was based on certain aspects. So the 200 plus games is actually based on behavioral economic theory, and then the 5 years is based on cognitive. So it's actually based on science, not on just some random numbers that I threw together. It's actually ended up having to do research on it, why that mattered. There was a certain threshold for value. But if you look at the Montreal Canadiens, like, I don't know if it was an evaluation issue. I don't know if it was a process issue. I don't know if it was an issue in their rankings, because I've sat in the room at NHL when they're putting together their rankings for the draft, and it's chaos.
Yeah.
Because sometimes what is on the scouting report does not correlate to what's on the ranking. They're like, because there's a misinformation flow between what your attributes say and what you say in the report, and then what your value process is for your rankings. And it's basically a free-for-all of guys yelling and screaming at each other because I want this guy above this guy. But
yeah, we saw that with
like,
the Philadelphia Flyers draft video from when they took Sam Morin. Where
exactly.
It was like the draft day, and they like moved him up from like way low in the first round up into like their top 5 choices or something like that on draft day for no reason.
For no reason. And this happens more than you realize in the conversations I've had with teams where this kind of stuff happens. And I've sat down and talked with directors of amateur scouting who try to help their staff recognize the issues when we are taking scouting reports and putting them into a list and then compressing lists. It's extremely difficult. Like, I built a system to help myself do that because I just kept making mistakes over and over again. And I'm like, what's going on here? And so I had to prioritize based on a bunch of different attributes and playing styles and all these other factors of value. So I started taking economic values and adding them in, like scarcity, like understanding what's value. Like, I hear crazy. It was a comment. As much as I love Gordie Clark, he's a great guy. He ran the draft for the Rangers, and it was the year they took McElrath. And I was on the floor because we're doing the show live, right beside the stage. And then the first round's over, and I'm like, Gordie, like, you had Fowler sitting there. Like, why didn't you take Fowler? Oh, but we had too many guys like that. I'm like, you can never have enough offensive defensemen. I don't care. Like, It's scarcity. There's like, I looked the other day, I think I categorized 25 or 26 offensive defensemen in the NHL. That's it. So that's scarcity. So automatically they have value. It's no different than power forwards have scarcity in the NHL. So that's why Matthew Tkachuk in a redraft is probably number 2 because of that. Right. So, like, understand, like, when you're putting these rankings together, it's a whole different, like, Brad and I get into this on the show about that because I think it's probably one of our funnest things to talk about. So when you're looking at from a Montreal Canadiens perspective I think they have to completely come in. And although, I'm sure Marty Lapointe's going to do a very good job of keeping things on the rails, but really strongly evaluate like what you look for in attributes on a player, like how you weight and measure those attributes, and then like what playing styles are more valuable, and then how do you put the rankings together, because they can't afford to make any misses anymore. And then what I didn't really understand, I've never got the answer fully, and there was part of me that didn't really want to ask either, was you brought in a couple guys like Rick Dudley and Shane Churla. who have excellent track records, especially Rick Dudley, maybe one of the best scouts I've ever met. Like the guy was like, you think he's old school and he's not. He's about as up to date in that you could possibly imagine. And they started turning some things around. They started collecting some players. And I looked at their drafts. I'm like, hey, they got some guys in the second and third rounds. There's some potential there. And then both of them are gone. Like the area that you have the most problem with, you brought in two guys that can help you, and then they go. They're off in Florida. Like, what are you doing? I didn't understand that. Like, what the hell? Like, that's the area where your whole organization has plummeted. Now, part of the issue I've always seen is, and it happened in New Jersey too, because they had horrendously awful draft efficiency as well, is they had an elite goaltender.
Yes, covers up so much
and
problems.
It covers up all their warts, right? So they could get away with, like, I'm looking at Montreal. I'll pull up their numbers now in comparative. In those 10 years, 06 to 15.
A commenter, before you keep going, commenter says, I feel like I'm in school. I hope that means in a good way, that you're learning something that you're passionate about.
Oh, yeah. No. This is how teams get mad at or fans get mad at teams for drafting crappy. Well, this is it. In 10 years, you had 66 picks. You got 11 players. 11. Like, if they didn't have that year in 2007, where they dinged, like they had a Grand Slam home run of 4 players, oh my God.
Yeah,
where would they be?
And also,
where would they be?
If they had kept Ryan McDonough from that 2007 draft,
yes.
Trevor Timmons could have retired after that draft and gone down as a legend. You drafted 2 players who for a time were number 1 defensemen, and you drafted a guy who was like the 3rd or 4th best goal scorer in the league for like a 10-year period. And you still had
Yannick Weber as a number 6, just as a throw-in.
Like, that was a phenomenal draft, and since then it's not been great.
Let's see, 0, Brendan Gallagher, Nathan Beaulieu, Alex Galchenyuk, Jacob Delarose, Artturi Lehkonen, and Sven. And he's barely marginal. No, he's not even in the league.
Andrighetto?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought he was good. I think he should have stayed in the league for longer, but...
Yeah. And so that's it. You had 4 years out of 10 where you got donuts.
Yep.
Donuts. You have to pull 2 a year or forget it. You're not contending.
And making bank on first-round picks is very important, and the Canadiens have flat out not.
Yeah, you got to hit in the first 3 rounds. And here, I'll tell you a crazy stat. So from 2011 to 2015, the Pittsburgh Penguins, who were drafting low, had 11 picks in the first 3 rounds. Guess how many picks are going to go on? Those players out of the 11 are going to go on to play 200 games.
I don't know.
All 11.
All 11.
11.
Wow.
The league average is 46%. So it lets you, just because you're picking high doesn't mean you can't get players to play. But it also says something about their player development and what they had in Wilkes-Barre. And I think one of the best things Montreal ever did was move their farm team to Laval.
Yes.
That's critically important. Right. One, it's also for acquisition of getting good American League players and their prospects, because they look at it and say, oh, I can just get an apartment and a condo and I'd never have to leave the city. I'm always going to be here. That matters in terms of acquiring players and retention. That's critical. So it's man, I'm sorry, Habs fans, but it's going to be uphill trudging, and whether they're going to be successful, I'm looking at their list of their prospects from 2017 to 2021, they're going to have to spend a lot of money on player development. I mean, a lot of money on personnel to ensure that they hit, because I'm looking at 17 players of those 5 years, and they got to get at least 10. They got to get at least 10 to play 200 plus games minimum.
And that's going to be critical, because we had a comment on the stream chat saying, do you think this team will be competitive in the window that having Suzuki and Caulfield provide? I feel like that's a pretty wide window, because those players are very young.
That could be 7 years.
Yeah, exactly. But in order to compete relatively quickly, if they want this to be a fast rebuild, it can't just be about revamping their draft process from now on. because
it's going to be about their development now.
Yes, they have to take what they already have and build something out of those players. They've got to maximize all or a lot of those players as much as they can to get some wiggle room, right? Because you can't turn this around. Even if they were to get Edmonton Oilers lucky and draft Shane Wright and Connor Bedard this year and next year,
that's not enough.
It would be a great start. But with how much they're going to have to sell off to get to that point, and like to be this bad next year, I think they're going to have to, the teardown is going to have to be pretty extreme, because I think, especially if Carey Price is part of the organization next year, if Caden Primo becomes a legitimate even number, like 1A goal or 1B goaltender,
1B,
like the injury luck won't be as bad. Please let there not be
no more
COVID situation next year. Not just for them, for the whole damn world. But all those factors that have really gone against them this year will probably not go against them as severely next year. So to get to that level, they're gonna have to sell off a lot, and in order to recover quickly, it would have to
be like Arizona, and that's just, I don't know.
It's not going to happen that way. I think. Like, they can get to a point where they think they could probably pick like top 5 next year, but they're going to need some lottery luck, and they're probably going to have to settle for not Bedard, but like that draft is very top. Like the top is very
potentially,
high.
Yeah, absolutely. So. Yeah, I mean, you look at their prospect list, like Palin has to play. Josh Brook has to play for them.
Yeah, I think Caulfield has to be a 30-goal scorer.
Yes. I mean, Eichedin would be great if you could get him in. Mulonen would be great if you could get him in. And Caulfield has to play. Gooley's got to play. Luke Tuck's got to play. Misak's got to play. I don't know what you're like. I don't even want to discuss Logan Mailloux in that situation, but that's a whole nother thing. Riley Kidney's going to have to play. Like Matthias Norlander's going to have to play. Now they don't have to play in top lines. Of course, Caulfield certainly should, but if you can get round out your third and fourth lines with these prospects, and you can round out your sort of fourth, fifth, and sixth defensemen with these prospects, what it does is it allows you not to have to go into free agency and pay 2 to 3 times more in terms of salary cap, and then allows you to not have to spend assets to go get those players, because that's what kills teams. Look at the Vancouver Canucks as a perfect example of when their prospects don't come in, and you have to supplement them with making poor decisions like paying Jay Beagle $3 million a year.
Yes.
Right. You have to avoid that. So even if a fan says, "Oh, but he's only, an F10." Yeah, but it's better paying that guy, that young kid, $1 million than paying some vet 2.5 or 2. Right. All those $500,000, $250,000, $1 million, that adds up. I use Vancouver as an example because they were one of the worst asset management teams in terms of their cap in the salary cap era. So you sort of want to avoid that. And you do that by bringing in your prospects. I know fans sometimes get mad, and we get the comments from our show is like, "Oh, but he's only a third liner." He's a third liner in the NHL, right? That you didn't have to pay more to get. Yeah. So that's where the money spent in player development saves you on the acquisition cost moving forward. And then that allows you to trade up if you need to, if there's a player available, right? Or, there are situations that come where, you look at the Rangers or you look at the LA Kings coming. Kings are a perfect example. And of now what they can do is start loading up and trading away some prospects and picks to get some better players. And speaking of the Kings, I know they're trying to fill some, spots with their assistant GMs. That's hard to do. So maybe Daniel Briere comes in and is assistant GM for Laval. I think that'd be a really great spot for him because of his time in the ECHL and managing that. He understands what needs to be done. I think that potentially is a really nice fit. But then you're looking at an assistant GM to run your pro and amateur, and you're not going to get these sideways moves. They just don't like doing that. It happens occasionally when another GM comes and takes his former assistant GM. It happened in Philly when Chuck left Minnesota, he brought Brent Flair with him. So that happened in that respect. But if I look at a name that you want to improve your drafting and you want to improve your pro scouting, then I would look at a name like Mark Yannetti. out of the Los Angeles Kings, who is currently just the director of scouting. So it's a bump up, but he's run both departments. And the LA Kings in the salary cap era have had have the top 5 best drafting development record in the league, and they've won 2 cups. And he rebuilt a whole system again. Now, prior to that, he had help with Mike Fuda because they were kind of but now he's done it on his own with his own staff. And in conversations I've had with on my show, I think he's really highly intelligent. And one of the interesting comments I got about him from a former colleague who's now a coach in the NCAA, he said, "Oh, how'd you like working with Marcinetti?" He goes, "Great." And he goes, "He's a pretty smart guy." And he goes, "No, I don't think you understand. He goes, "No, he's the Will Hunting of the NHL." That was the description, like that genius potential level of just really understanding his craft. And his dad was a longtime scout as well. So, if you're looking at it from Kent Hughes' perspective, I don't know if LA would let him go, but that's a guy at target, because then you could bump him up to assistant GM and then give him that role. And then he could oversee those departments and then work in tandem, obviously, with Daniel Briere. And they really sort of take over the acquisition and the development of what's going on, because Marcinetti has a background with player development, and he understands analytics really well. Robert Volman works with him in LA. So in the conversations I've had with Mark, he's more progressive than you could possibly imagine from that respect. So I think Ken Hughes has some really interesting opportunities to hire some really strong personnel to sort of revamp what the Montreal is doing. And hey, I'd knock on Mr. Molson's door and say, "Hey, we need some beer money. We got to spend some money here. We're going to spend some money to bring in people." So, and more people like these staffs have to be way larger than they were before. Way larger. It's too much work for 1 or 2 people. You can't have 2 people in your player development department. I mean, I'm not even talking about the goalies. I think the goalie department should be 4 people deep. Like, honestly, not including the development of just the defense and the forwards. That should be 6 deep. And then you should probably have like at least one development for prospects, 1 in the American League and 1 in the NHL. Like, you're going to have to at least need 3 guys. And then you definitely going to have somebody in Europe. So you got to add another one. That's another 4. That's 4. So, these are the kind of interesting conversations like I like having about Montreal, because it's a clean slate.
Exactly.
And how often in a franchise's history where you get to have a clean slate, where like not only do you have opportunity, and there's people like we'll have knife fights to work for the Montreal Canadiens. It's the Montreal Canadiens. Like, they are the New York Yankees of the NHL. If you want to work for a team, you want to work for the Montreal Canadiens. I don't care who you are. Like, look at Jeff Gorton's face. He's like, in his press conference, "No, it's great that I'm from Boston, but it's the Montreal Canadiens," right? Like, I remember going to the Montreal Forum on a road trip, and it was just like, it's hallowed ground. Like, I think it's basically, if you want to work for the Habs, it's like, let's get into the Mad Max Thunderdome, 2-man enter, 1-man leave, or woman, doesn't matter. Get in there, and whoever survives, you're hired, because that's how coveted this to work for this organization is.
100%. We had a comment in the stream chat saying 5 years ago, the Avs were the worst team in the league, historically bad, but there was no teardown rebuild in Denver, just patience. And you're saying you Canadians need patience. I'm going to push back on that quite a bit, because
the drafting was horrible. They were actually the second worst.
Yes. However, at that point in time, the Avalanche already had Nathan McKinnon, Mikko Rantanen, and Gabe Landeskog. I believe that was after they'd already traded Ryan O'Reilly, but like they traded Ryan O'Reilly like that year, I believe.
I believe that's correct. Yeah.
And they still had Matt Duchene, who they traded for. The return on Matt Duchene was absolutely phenomenal. Like, Joe Sakic is a magician for that. But that team, there's like 4 players left. So to say that there was no teardown, like, there definitely was no big tank, but they did rebuild on the fly. Like, they changed things a lot.
Yeah.
And they got
things. I agree. Yeah,
and as much as like it was a high draft choice, they also got incredibly lucky with Cale Makar, because guys who were drafted out of like major junior very rarely turn into what he turned into. Like, there was signs,
Well,
but even the best sign of what Cale Makar could have become has been blitzed completely by what he is now.
I watched him. I went into and watched him in Alberta Junior A, and I flew into Calgary and then went up and watched him play a bunch of times. And it was obvious that he was going to be an offensive defenseman. Was he going to be 70, 80 points a year defenseman? I never projected that, but I thought, well, I remember in the drafts and talking to Russ, and we do our draft show. We end up doing like 4 hours of draft coverage, 6 hours of pre-draft coverage. And I said, I think he's going to probably be a 2-3 and get you 50, maybe 60 points a year. Like I didn't like, I thought, oh, okay, this kid's special. You're going to take him in the top 10. Like, this is going to be a bona fide, really good player. But then there's stratosphere superstar. But I give Colorado credit. One of the things they did, like obviously with Joe Sakic and Craig Billington is there as well during that time, is they won almost all their trades.
Yep.
And then their free agents, they did really well there too. And winning all your trades is rare. So it was like, I actually went back and started researching all their trades. I'm like, wait a minute, how many did they win versus how many did they lose? And it was like way in the favor of wins. So that doesn't happen as often in the NHL. That's they had a great run of winning trades.
And
but
it wasn't,
also,
they weren't trades for like depth players either. I mean,
no, they were trades for like those middle six, like, top 4D.
Yeah, like I find it's easier to win the depth player trades where like you can kind of edge it one way or the other.
Pieces,
and you like put him in a good situation. It looks like a win. I feel like Bergevin was very good at doing that, and he to be fair, he won some really big trades too. The Jeff Petrie trade, the Phil Deneau trade, those were huge.
100%.
But not at the level of like the Devon Taves trade. Although I'd say like Petrie's probably the same, but Devon Taves, that trade is ridiculous.
No,
and
I mean,
then
because based
trade,
on what they already had, yeah. No, Petrie was that was a great trade, and I give Bergie credit. Like, in terms of trading, it was the one area as a general manager he was really strong in, and the players legitimately liked him. What crushed them is their drafting. Their drafting development is just completely. It's the worst in the league in the salary cap era. Zero. Like, they were number 3rd. The worst.
Yep.
Colorado was 29. Vancouver was 28. New Jersey was 26. You see a theme here? Yeah, you may not even realize it, but Chicago was 25.
I mean,
their drafting's been bad. It's been bad.
And at least Chicago has the excuse of they were winning cups, right?
They were winning. Well, they were winning cups, and they had they had drafted really well to a certain point, and then they lived on it, and then it just went right over the cliff, and that's what really crushed them. They missed. There was a lot of misses, a lot of and it's not the first round misses. It's that second and thirds. You got to hit on those, and occasionally you got to hit in the 4th to 7th. I pulled up a crazy stat. In the salary cap era, sort of 06 to 15. And the reason why I say that is because everything changed after the salary cap came in. So if you look at those 10 years, on average, 4 to 7 round, there's only 15 players that'll play more than 200 games. 15 out of those 4 rounds on average. So look at the last year's draft, 4 to 7 rounds, pick your 15 players who you think are going to play. And that's all you're going to get. So if you're a team who can ding one of those, maybe once every second year, once every third year, you can once every third year, you can ding that. That makes all the difference in the world, because that's another acquisition cost you don't have to have, right? That makes all you look at San Jose, they get guys late all the time. Anaheim Ducks, they're great. Martin Madden, we talked about Martin Madden maybe being a GM candidate. Martin Madden and his group are the 3rd best drafting team in the league. They're great.
Yeah, and they've got a slew of really high-end guys coming up in Anaheim.
And they always come, right? I mean, it was just, Murray's, asset management was poor.
Yep.
And they should be a contender. Based on what they draft and develop, they should have been a contender. And I think Montreal, I know things feel pretty grim right now, but if they can develop some of these kids in the last 5 drafts into players, at least get 10 of them, I think you're on your way. You're going to be okay. Especially with this potentially getting the first overall pick. If you get Shane Wright, That kid's a player. He's a gamer. I like him.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of people who don't watch junior hockey, and frankly, I don't either. Like, I don't have the time. I watched him a couple games in the juniors, but a lot of people who don't watch Shane Wright talking about how he's going to be a bust. But everybody that I talk to that watches this kid says he's not a franchise level offensive star, and don't expect that to be, but he's a guy that does all the little things correctly and will carry a top line. That's still great.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like, now I'm not comparing him to these two players because please don't yell at us, and don't yell at me, and don't yell at my Twitter for it. It's a similar style of play. He's a similar style to Jonathan Toews on how he plays. Will he be Jonathan Toews? I don't know. Like that's a far-fetched comparison. Right? That's a tough comparison. But his playing style of how he plays on the ice, that's how it's similar, right? So, but if he can play, can he be a number one center, but he doesn't have the massive offensive numbers where maybe he puts up 65, 70 points a year, but drives that line and allows a Cole Caulfield to be dynamic, for a Drouin to be dynamic because he takes care of the middle of the ice and defensive responsibilities and does all the heavy lifting to let them do what they need to do creatively. That's where his extra value is. It's not the extra 10 or 15 points in the score sheet. It's the other things that allow his other line mates to push up to make up for the points that he's not going to produce. That to me is and in the playoffs, he's going to be a gamer in the playoffs. And that's where I see him, where his level of play will not drop. But hey, if you get him first overall, please be patient. He's an 18-year-old kid.
Yes,
right.
This is true.
Thrown into the Montreal Canadiens. Honestly, my suggestion is send him back for another.
You think
year.
so? One more year?
I would.
Yeah.
I
mean, especially if they're tanking, right? Like, if the idea is to be bad. Yeah.
It's like how many times I've seen players not produce and end up falling below their expectation, but even their ceiling level. Yeah. The difference between floor and ceiling is because it's too much too soon. Happens all the time. Like every draft is littered with guys like that. Yeah. So just be cautious and careful.
Yeah, we had another comment here saying the Craig Rive trade is still legendary for one Montreal guys of it. That was Bob Gainey back in the day, I believe.
Yeah.
The fact is they're still gaining from that, because they got the pick that became Max Pacioretty, and Josh George is back. They traded Max Pacioretty for Nick Suzuki and the pick that became Matthias Norlinder, I believe. So there's potentially going to be two roster players, including the current first-line center for the Montreal Canadiens, still coming out of that trade. Like, subsequent trades, but the genesis of it is that trade. I think they got a second-round pick back for Josh George. I don't know if they made bank off of that. It might was that the Arturi Lehkonen pick? Maybe. It might. No, it was. It would have been a high second rounder.
That went to San Jose.
Josh George's? No. Josh George's was traded to Buffalo.
Buffalo, that's right.
So I don't remember if they got Buffalo's pick in that deal. Somebody can look that up if they want. It may have been the year that they drafted Zach Vucali. Not entirely sure.
Yeah,
it would have been later because George's was still there for the first couple of years of Bergevin, I believe. But it's interesting to see the trade trees, like what that Steve does on Sportsnet and everything.
It goes nuts. It's nuts.
The ripple effects of trades is insane, especially big ones, right? Like, there's still players on teams right now who were affected by the Gretzky trade,
which is nuts.
It's crazy.
I mean, that can go on forever. Like, you could run this tree in for a generation if you really wanted to. So that's what makes it really sort of fascinating from that standpoint. There's a point where it gets kind of silly.
It is,
right? Once you get past 10 years, you're kind of
but it's just fun, right?
Yeah. Oh no, it's super fun. Hey, look, from a guy who works on NHL video game for EA. Yeah, trust me, man. I'm a kid when it comes to that kind of stuff. So, and also don't yell at me about the player ratings. If there's players that you don't think are fairly rated, it's because I hate your team and I hate your players. So
explain Cliff Ronning.
Yeah.
The ultimate sleeper pick in EA Sports games back in the day.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I didn't do that because I didn't start until the fall of 2006. So I've been doing the NHL, the AHL, the CHL since then. So I'm running on 15. This will be my 15th season. So yes. And I've actually, it's really funny. None of the players really complain about it. I've only had one player bitch at me once. He called me out on TSN. So that was Sam Gagne. He gave it to me. So we had Zach Stortini come into our big facility in Burnaby, out in Vancouver, because he's doing some fighting models with us. So he went on with Ryan Rashad, and they're talking about it. And Ryan asked him about his rating, and Sam just roasted me. And he said, yeah, I talked to the guy who does the ratings. He said the overall doesn't matter. It's about your individual attributes. And it's true. The overall doesn't matter. It has no application in the game. It's just a weighted number based on your playing style. So he got mad at me. So I bumped into Dave Gagne, his dad. He's working for the Canucks. Saw him in the press box. I said, hey, Dave, you tell Sam I'm dropping his toughness down to 60, and Michael Nylander is going to beat the crap out of him every game. So he laughed his ass off, called up Sam, told him that. 2 games later, he gets in a fight with Craig Conroy. And I see him in the locker room, like, you did that on purpose. He's like, oh, yeah. And then all the other his teammates were all laughing at him. Yeah. Because he goes, how come my scoring isn't better? I'm like, because you haven't even posted 20 goals yet. He's like, they're yelling at him, you suck, you suck. Yeah, we had a good laugh about it. He's actually he's a great guy and a great sport about it. But players never really complain to me. Some of the tough guys will say, hey, can you bump my skating up? My kid likes to play me, and I know I'm not the best skater. Like Brian McGrattan, I'd bump his skating up a little bit. Or when was it? There was a player in Philadelphia Flyers who got hit in the nuts and it broke his cup. Wasn't it Lindbergh?
Was it Patrick Thoresen?
Yes, Patrick Thoresen.
Because he actually lost a testicle. TMI, yeah, I know, but yeah.
Yeah, so he got hit, and then my co-host at the time, Russ Cohen, is based out of Philly, and I texted Russ, and he said, when you see Patrick downstairs, tell him I'm bumping his toughness up 7 points, because anybody can get hit in the junk and come back and then lose that and still lose it and still come back. He's okay in my books. And he told him that. He goes, that's awesome. He was pumped. He was pumped. So I was like, yep, just on principle, I got to bump up your toughness, right? Because that's crazy.
It's fantastic. We had some comments on like the trade tree stuff. Somebody said that they thought that Jan Mysak was a part of that trade tree with Craig.
That could have been it.
And someone said that they traded the pick that they got for Josh Georges for Andrew Shaw. Then they traded Andrew Shaw back to the Chicago Blackhawks for a 2020 second round pick, which became Jan Mysak. So Jan Mysak, I believe, is the last potential. Oh no, there's also a third round pick from Chicago, but I don't know what they did with that. It might have been their Dmitry Kostenko pick from last year, which right. I don't know much about him, but most likely Jan Mysak is the last player from the Georges side. The Pacioretty side, obviously, Suzuki is going to be a Montreal Canadian for a long time. And
they need him for him to play. They need Mysak to play. He's got to be a middle 6 forward for them moving forward. So that's look. They invested a lot of picks. Like they got 3 in the top 2, 3 in the top 2, first and a second in 19. I'm looking at the list. There's like 4 in 2018, like 3 in 2017. Like they got to hit on those. They have to. Spend whatever money is necessary to develop those players. Like, I don't care if you spend like $2 million. You got to go do it.
Yeah.
Like,
they've got to hire skills coaches as well. Guys that work with those kids daily and not just in the American Hockey League. They've got to get like meetings with their college guys, meetings with their, like somebody who goes into their junior leagues. Guy go over to Europe and work with them, just flying around all the time, working with players, seeing what they need to work on, enhancing their skills, working a little bit on their weaknesses. All that stuff.
And using technology for that. So I've seen some really interesting new technology for VR that helps players with their development, but also being able to build systems in place for your player development. So using video capabilities effectively, but also understanding so that you integrate your other departments in terms of biometrics and understanding, okay, so this is why you're having issues with your skating because, your attack posture is off. And then you are like, you're going to the outside edges too often here. And this kind of stuff I end up talking with player development people about is making sure that you can break that down effectively, and then having the video components to show them, okay, this is what we need to do. Now, here are the drills for us to correct that. And we're going to do it, all these different types of drills, until it becomes muscle memory. And then the problem is, like, it's not entirely solved, but what you have to do is try to build a player up to the best capability of what they are. Because you can't say, oh, I'm going to take this kid and like watch Connor McDavid and be that. Well, that's ridiculous. That doesn't happen. Like your body type and your muscle construction, all of that, like your skeletal construction is all different. So, and how you skate and how you move is all different from other people. So you have to build it for that player. Right. So that's where, like, I like having these conversations and guests on our show about player development. And then how do you tactically build players? Like, what do you look for? How do you redo it? How do you build them up and then get them to the point where they can be an asset in an NHL level from what the skill set they have and the body they have? Not looking at it, oh, I want to emulate this player. Well, it may not even be possible to do that. So you have to have staff who recognize that. So you integrate your departments. This is where I think interdisciplinary research and interdisciplinarian is necessary, so you don't have silos. And that's the hallmark of like fantastic and successful Fortune 500 companies. Why not do that with the Montreal Canadiens? They're a Fortune 500 company. And, the Molson family has the money to spend it. So outspend people and like that. Toronto's starting to do that and trying to do that. So why can't Montreal run them down? And they could. I think within a year, 2 years, they could run them down and surpass them if they dedicate themselves to that.
Well, that's a great spot to end it. I mean, get all the Leafs fans upset about that and get everybody talking, because that's.
Yeah, I'm going to get yelled at by the Leaf fans on my Twitter. Don't.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to. I'm going to clip that for the show. Send it out to social media tomorrow morning. That'd be great. I'm gonna
get bombarded.
Oh, like, sorry.
Berkshire, like.
Worth it though. Worth it. All right. Thanks so much, Shane, for coming, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. Before we clock out here, though, Shane, tell everybody where they can find your stuff.
Well, you can look on Twitter, so at Shane Malloy, and then at HP Radio, so it's Hockey Prospect Radio. We will be on air tomorrow at 8 to 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and again at 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sirius XM NHL Network Radio. It is channel 91, and we're going to get the show onto a podcast soon, so you can get all the replays and the archives as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks to everybody for watching, and we'll see you on, I think it's Monday is the next game. So we'll see you then.